Okay, everyone. Oh, thank you so much, everyone, for coming together to immerse ourselves in this rich body of wisdom we call Torah. We're going to read through this week's Torah portion, which is Parshat Vayeshev. It's in the book of Genesis. Begins with chapter 37, with verse 1. We'll read through the English translation of our portion. I'll share with you a focus study about it, and then we'll open it up for our collaborative conversation about it. If you'd like to go ahead and join me in saying a blessing, giving thanks to this moment, feel free to do so. Baruch atah
Adonai,
Asher Kishon Ivana La'aso. Great Torah.
Thank you, God, for the opportunity to immerse ourselves in words and deeds and relationships of Torah. I'll share with you the opening verses and then invite others to have an opportunity to read as well. Now, Jacob was settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan. This then is the line of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. And when his brothers saw that their father had loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. And once Joseph had a dream, which he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field when suddenly my sheaves stood up and remained upright. And your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheep." His brothers answered, "You mean to reign over us? You mean to rule over us?" And they hated him even more for his talk about his dreams. Richard, would you like to read verse 9?
He dreamt yet another dream and recounted it to his brothers, saying, "Look now, I have dreamt another dream. And look, the sun, the moon, the 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he recounted it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him, saying, "What is this dream that you dreamt? Your mother, your brothers, and I, must we really come to bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers detested him, but his father kept the matter in mind. When his brothers went to tend their father's flock in Shem, Israel said to Joseph, "Surely your brothers are tending the flock at Shem by now. Come, let me send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." Israel then said to him, "Pray go see how your brothers are and how the flock is doing, and bring me back word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shem. There, a man happened on him as he was wandering in the countryside. The man asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me, please, where they are tending the flock?" The man said, "They left this place, yes. I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan.
Thank you so much. Let me invite Sherry. We're at verse 18 if you want to read all of it.
They saw him in the distance, and before he near them, they wickedly plotted against him to bring about his death. They said to one another, "Here comes that master of dreams. Now then, let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits and say, 'A wild animal devoured him.' Then we'll see what becomes of this dream." But when Reuben heard this, he saved him from the hands by saying, "Let us not strike him with another blow." Reuben said to them, "Do not shed blood. Throw him into the pit, here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand against him, in order to deliver him from their hands, to restore him to their father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his coat, the coat of many colors that he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it.
Steve, would you like to read verse 25?
They had sat down for a week when they looked up and saw down. Ishmael traveling from the camels were loaded with on. They were heading down to Egypt. Judah then said to his brother, "I will profit them if they kill our brother and cover up his blood." Then his father fell to the rich world, and our family not him. After all, he was blood and went back in the father's brother's student. When the midnight traders came through, they killed Joseph outside of the court. And so they killed Joseph and found Joseph and children to the Ishmael to carry Joseph back to the
Thank you so much. Margot, we're at verse 29, if you'd like to read a little bit.
Thank you. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, he said, "The boy is gone. Now what am I to do?" Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic into the blood of the kid. They had the ornamental tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is this your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son is my son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him." Joseph was torn by the beast. Jacob rent, excuse me. Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, no, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him to in Egypt to Potiphar, a court courier of Pharaoh and his chief steward.
Thank you so much. Mark Levinstein, we're at the start of chapter 38, if you'd like to read a bit.
Thank you, Rabbi. About that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite whose name was Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and cohabited with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and he named him Onan. Once again she bore a son, and he named him Shelah. He was at Shezib when she bore him. Judah got a wife for Er, his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to the Lord, and the Lord took his life. Then Jonah said to Onan, "Join with your brother's wife, and do your duty as her brother-in-law, and provide offspring for your brother." But Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing to the Lord, and he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Catherine, we're at verse 12, if you'd like to read a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hira the Adullamite. And Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing." So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, Here, let me sleep with you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. What, she asked, will you pay for sleeping with me? He replied, I will send a kid from my flock. But she said, You must leave a pledge until you have sent it. And he said, What pledge shall I give you? She replied, Your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adullamite, to redeem the pledge from the woman. But he could not find her. He inquired of the people of that town, Where is the cult prostitute, the one at Enaim by the road? But they said, There has been no prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I could not find her. Moreover, the townspeople said, Lest we become a laughingstock. Oh, said, There has been no prostitute here. Judah said, Let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock. I did send her this kid, but you did not find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry. Bring her out, said Judah, and let her be burned. As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she added, Examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, She is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he was not intimate with her again.
Let me invite Robert, if you would continue there, verse 27, and then read some more in the beginning of chapter 39.
Okay, thank you very much. And it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, This came out first. And it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother came out. And she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her.
Thank you, Robert. And Jay, we're at verse 11, if you'd like to read a little bit.
Thank you, Rabbi. One such day, he came into the house to do his work. None of the household being there inside, she caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside." She kept his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to me daily with me, but when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside." When his master heard the story that his wife told him, namely, "Thus and so your slave did to me," he was furious. So Joseph's master had him put in prison where the king's prisoners were confined. But even while he was there in prison, the Lord was with Joseph. He extended kindness to him and disposed the chief jailer favorably toward him. The chief jailer put in Joseph's charge all of the prisoners who were in that prison, and he was the only one to carry out everything that was done there. The chief jailer did not supervise anything that was in Joseph's charge because Adonai was with him, and whatever he did, Adonai made successful.
And Justin, we're now at the very start of chapter 40.
Thank you, Rabbi. Now it came about after these events that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker sinned against their master, against the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh became incensed with his two chamberlains at the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he placed them in the prison of the house of the chief of the slaughterers, into the prison, a place where Joseph was imprisoned. And the chief of the slaughterers appointed Joseph to be with them, and he served them. And they were a year in prison. Now both of them dreamed a dream, each one his dream on the same night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the cupbearer and baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. And Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, and behold, they were troubled. And he asked Pharaoh's chamberlains who were with him in prison of his master's house, saying, "Why are your faces sad today?" And they said to him, "We've dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter for it." And Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me now." So the chief cupbearer related his dream to Joseph, and he said to him, "In my dream, behold, a vine is before me, and on the vine 3 tendrils, and it seemed to be blossoming, and its buds coming out. And then its clusters ripened into grapes. And Paro's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Paro's cup and placed them on Paro's palm, the cup on Paro's palm." Joseph said, "This is its meaning. The 3 tendrils are 3 days. In another 3 days, Paro will number you with the other officers, and he will restore you to your position, and you will place the Paro's cup onto his hand, according to your previous custom, when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when things go well for you. Please do me a favor and mention me to Paro, and you will get me out of this house. For I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and here too I have done nothing, for which they have put me in a dungeon.
Thank you, Joseph. And Rose, now we're at verse 16, if you'd like to read.
When the chief baker saw how favorably he had interpreted, he said to Joseph, in my dream, similarly, there were 3 open work baskets on my head. In the uppermost baskets were all kinds of food for Pharaoh that a baker prepares, and the birds were eating it out of the basket above my head. Joseph answered, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale you upon a pole, and the birds will pick off your flesh. On the 3rd day, his birthday, Pharaoh made a banquet for all his officials, and he singled out his chief cupbearer and his chief baker from among his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hands. But the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him.
Thank you, everyone. That's our entire Torah portion for this week. I'd like to share with you a focus study about it. If you have a copy of the study sheet, I invite you to take it out. And this year, as I was reading the Torah portion, what really caught my attention were some parallels in the structure between the end of last week's Torah portion and the beginning of this week's Torah portion. And I'd like to share that with you and see where that takes us. So at the end of last week's Torah portion, we have in chapter 36 with verse 1, the Hebrew says, Ve'ela todot Esav. This is the line of Esau. And in this week's Torah portion, the very beginning, verse 2, it says in Hebrew, Ele toldot Yaakov. This is the line of Jacob. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that this way of describing Esau's progeny, his household, is word for word the same as is described this week in the opening portion of Jacob's portion. And then I looked at it again a little bit more closely, and I noticed some other similarities in how last week's Torah portion was describing Esau, and how this week it's describing Jacob. So, for example, in last week in chapter 36 and verse 8, it says, Vayeshev Esav, and Esau dwelt, and then it says Bahar Seir, in the mountains of Seir. And this week's Torah portion opens up with similar language, Vayeshev, and Jacob dwelt. And then it goes on to say, Be'eretz Megurei Aviv, Be'eretz Canaan, in the wanderingness of his father, in the land of the wanderings of his father, in the land of Canaan. So on the one hand, there is structurally these parallels as to how Jacob and Esau are presented to us, and there's also some differentiations. And I thought, isn't that interesting, the way these two who are twins are now being similarly described, but yet there's some gradations of differentiation. And those differentiations, as I looked upon them, to me were indicating and revealing a different approach to life in general. And Torah seems to want to emphasize for us that there are similarities between these two, but the differentiations is what's really profoundly significant. And so let's look at those differentiations. So in number 2 in the study sheet, after when it introduces Esau, it says, Esau went to a land. And our medieval commentator Rashi looks at that and says, that's interesting. What does it mean to say to a land, as opposed to, why doesn't it say went to the land? Why doesn't it say it went to the land that was part of the family promise, the land of Canaan? And so this is what Rashi comes up with. Well, it says to a land because Esau wanted to live wherever he could. Because of the writ of obligation, your offspring shall be sojourners in a land not theirs, about which Esau said, let me get away from here. I will have no part of paying that obligation, which was placed on the seed of Isaac. Rashi notes that Esau does not want to pursue what has been promised to the family, the land of Canaan. Why? Because there seems to be an obligation that has been imposed on the acquisition of that land in Canaan, and that is that the progeny will be sojourners in a land not theirs. And Esau says, well, I don't want any part of that. I don't want to have to fulfill that obligation to have my descendants become people who are dispossessed from a land, who are just wandering around in a land that they don't control. No, I just want to quickly grab any land where I can raise my herds, raise my family, and be free of this obligation that seems to hover over my Isaac and his whoever fulfills that destiny of being part of this covenant. And then we look at how Jacob was presented, and it says Jacob was settled. And another commentator, known as the Rambam, looks at that and says, Jacob was different from Esau. And he goes on to say, Esau's line settled in a land that they took hold of as an everlasting possession. But Jacob lived as a sojourner in a land not theirs, Canaan's. This means they chose to live as sojourners in the chosen land, and that your offspring shall be sojourners in the land not theirs was fulfilled in them, not in Esau. When we look at this phrase that is quoted in both of these commentaries, that your offspring will be sojourners in a land not theirs, which was what God said to Abraham. And it's a matter of how one understands that phrase. On the one hand, it seems Esau is understanding that phrase to be a kind of curse, a threat. Your children, your descendants are just going to be wanderers. They won't be able to settle anywhere. They won't possess anything. Nothing will be, no land will be one that they own. And Esau says, I'm going to cut myself out of that curse and just grab a piece of land. And Jacob, perhaps, is suggested here by Rambam, doesn't view that phrase, your offspring shall be sojourners in land not theirs, not as a threat, but as a promise. What's the promise? The promise is that you will live in a land, you will live in a way that is one of constant turmoil, challenge, the opportunity for transformation, the opportunity to experience something that you don't know, and to, in the course of moving through that, to elevate yourself, become different than you are today. And so Jacob, the way this bit of commentary suggests is, he understands that, and even knowing how much turmoil and grief and disruption that way of living is going to involve, chooses that way, because he knows that that's the way of becoming transformed, of becoming truly an inheritor of the promise of fulfillment and fruition. So there's these different approaches to this phrase and this different way of living, whether one to take the expedient way or to take the long, tortuous path. And that's what we're going to explore a little bit further with a little bit more comment. So here is on the back, I have a quote from one of the great Hasidic rabbis known as the Ishbitzer Rebbe, and he quotes on this phrase as well. He says, Jacob settled the land of Canaan in the land of his father's sojournings. And then Ishbitzer says, he settled in the land of Canaan of humility. That's what Canaan comes from, this word Hana, which means humility. And he sought to dwell in peace. This peace obtains when a person behaves in such a way as to keep far from all doubt and guards himself from any evil act. That is the modality of peace. But in response to Jacob's desire for such peace, God told him that as long as a human being lives in a bodily existence, it is impossible to behave with extreme wariness and fear and humility. The Ishbitzer seems to be saying that what it really means to be a human being, which is, after all, our mission. That's who we are as a species. What does it mean to be a human being? What it means to be a human being is to expose oneself to dangers and challenges and risks and the unknown. And that the notion of trying to avoid all that is contrary to the very notion of what it means to be a human being. And here's what our contemporary of ours, commentator Aviva Zornberg, says more in explication of the Ishbitzer Rebbe's comment. The Ishbitzer suggests an eternal oscillation between extremes of fear and love, certainty and courage in the face of perplexity. A worldview based on fear and humility risks human atrophy. For such fear and humility grants all power to God. Only a vision in which the plot is unclear, in which anomalies bewilder serene faith, and integrities are torn apart, can open the possibility of human action. Cognitively, action means the capacity to reintegrate the fragments of experience into new wholes, in remembering, to create something unprecedented, a personal language of self-description. So I leave it up to those who are more experienced and dedicated practitioners of therapy protocols. But in part, this is what happens within a good therapy session, I think, which is that someone carries in their fragments of what they remember of their past and their lives, and the good therapist will guide them through kind of recrafting of those fragments into a new way of understanding one's life, that one can live one's life in a way that's self-beneficial and beneficial to others. It all hinges on the notion of the importance of not always living a life free of risk, not always living a life based upon certainty of what's going to happen, but of exposing oneself to risk, of entering into, if you will, the realm of the unknown. And in thinking about that, I came across this letter that the great poet John Keats wrote in 1817 to his brothers, George and Thomas. And he wrote this to them. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me. What quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously? I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. The concept here, negative capabilities, really what we mean by having this capacity to tolerate uncertainty. That's what makes the greatness. And that's, in his mind, is what made Shakespeare such a great writer of the human condition, because he was able to sense the depth of living with uncertainty. So it's not just in literature and art that we encounter these, but there has been a growing sense of the importance of living with a certain toleration of uncertainty. And that is in the 1990s, it actually became a field of study to understand the link between the incapacity to live with uncertainty and the generalized anxiety disorder that people have. And the greater that people had, the more people were not able to tolerate the unknown. The more they saw the unknown as a threat, the way Esau did, the more that they were likely to develop various symptoms of anxiety, whether it's eating disorders or other forms of unhealthiness psychologically. And so there was researchers at a university in Canada that developed this whole inability to tolerate uncertainty, the uncertainty intolerance measure that they developed. And in the 21st century, we have scientists who are trying to recorrect the notion that what science is all about is the accumulation of facts and knowledge. And one of those is Stuart Feinstein, who is a neurobiologist, and he wrote a book after he'd been teaching neurobiology to students for quite a while, and he realized that what they thought they were learning was information and facts, and that's what science was. And so he tried to correct that by writing this book called Ignorance, How It Drives Science and How Important Ignorance Is. And he says this: being a scientist requires having faith in uncertainty, finding pleasure in mystery, and learning to cultivate doubt. There's no surer way to screw up an experiment than to be certain of its outcome. So for him, what's important in science is knowledge becomes the driving force for greater ignorance. And that he says, when we sit around as scientists, we don't really sit around talking about facts. We talk about what don't you know? What are you intrigued by? What's a mystery to you? And that's what's energizing and inspiring. And now I would like to share with you our painting for this week, which is a painting by Julie Meretu, who was born in Ethiopia. And she and her family left Ethiopia when she was 1977, to escape the political chaos there. And the family settled in Michigan, where her father was a teacher. And she became an artist. And her art is primarily abstract. And it's abstract because abstract as a medium provides her the kind of visual vocabulary that for her is best able to express what life is, which is in the constant process of formation, where you have a mixture of identifiable and the unidentifiable, where the situation is constantly dynamic and in motion. And so here, this painting that I provided you is called Fourth Seal. It's one of 4 that she did as part of a series called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. And Slouching Towards Bethlehem evokes a book by Joan Didion, a novel by Joan Didion. It also evokes a poem by Yeats, and both of which present scenes of imminent total destruction and chaos in the world. And the title Fourth Seal is also evocative of the book of Revelation. You have these seals that are opened up, releasing out into the world of chaos and destruction. And the fourth seal is when death rides a horse and lays waste to the earth. So for her, she's introducing that because she is growing up and painting at a time, this was painted in 2020, when the world seemed to be bubbling towards some kind of state of confusion and chaos and violence and disruption. And she paints this, I suggest, not so much as a prophecy as perhaps the book of Revelation is intended to be, but really as a kind of provocation and question. What is happening? What does all this mean? And that notion about painting questions is really what's important to her. Here's her quote about it. Art's job is to complicate as much as possible. That's what we want art for. That's what we want poetry for, to be full of contradictions or to expose contradictions. That's where radical possibility exists. Imagining other possibilities is how things change. And she's also said that what she's interested in is the space in between, the moment of imagining what is possible and yet not knowing what that is. So I'm going to conclude by taking us back and finishing off the quote from the Ishbitzer, because when he has, he quote, the end of his quote above said, God told them that as long as human beings live in a bodily experience, it is impossible to behave with extreme wariness and fear and humility. And then he goes on to say, for God wants human acts. And in this world, human beings must act in love, in ways that are not completely clerical. And that caught my attention, the connection between love and ways not being completely clarified. And I thought, right, the way of love, love is not a guarantee of any specific outcome. It's a journey of shared effort and personal growth. It's a covenantal relationship. And that's the relationship that Torah is promoting, a covenantal one, where there's no guarantee about what the outcome might be, but there's the promise of growth and development. And so that's what I saw this week in this week's Torah portion, this emphasis on the importance of acts of love, which expose us and make us vulnerable, put us at risk, and present the greatest reward there could be, which is not only to grow into what it really means to be a human, but in the course of that, discover the divine as well. So with that, I'd love to know what your experience. I know, Norm, you had your hand up, and Robert, you've got yours up, and we'll get to Rose and everyone who wants to talk. Go ahead, Norm. Norm, you want to share with us? So have some thoughts?
Yeah, I'm turning on my microphone. So the ideas of Torah presenting a future to both Jacob and Esau, and as expanded and developed by Rashi and Rambam and the Ishbitzer Rebbe and the Moskowitz Rebbe, are speaking to me of a person's destiny as coming out of this context, a destiny which Esav is struggling against. He's going to be a sojourner, which means a temporary resident, and yet he's looking to be a permanent resident. He's struggling against his destiny. Jacob doesn't. Jacob is living with the duality of the promised land, and you're going to be enslaved for 400 years. You'll be away from the land. What does it mean to be promised a land when you're forced to stay in another land? There's the question of, when you have your destiny, what do you do with it? Do you struggle against it, or do you develop it and get the most out of it? I don't know when the final redaction of the story was, but it's also suggesting to me that it's a view towards the diaspora, and that the diaspora has an aspect of a land of opportunity. You have the promised land, but there's also value in the not promised land, whether it's Babylonia, whether it's the United States, or whether it's all over the world.
Rich, rich material there. Let me call upon others and then we'll see about putting some of it together. So let me call upon Robert, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much again for a lovely evening and your thoughts. I was going to make a comment, but before I do, what Norm mentioned made me think, this was really a very insightful comment for me personally, because going out of the promised land, the small one, the Jewish community went out into the greater world, the promised land of human hearts. And there are a lot of wonderful people of the Jewish faith, and they've touched a lot of hearts. I was thinking today, yesterday actually, my mother's best friend who lived down the street was actually Jewish. She wasn't a practicing Jew. My mother's Lebanese, so we had the world's problem solved. So, what does it mean to love the journey? When you mentioned love, I thought immediately. So, what does it mean to love the journey? That's the important thing. If we love the journey of life and we have a passion for it, then we move through life versus having life move through us. And what's the difference? So the first one, you have endless space and opportunity, imagination, love, all these things that we're all familiar with, versus the electrical fence of a closed box mentality. And a closed box is something I personally love to refer to because sometimes I think some people make their lives like that, where it's static and they don't want anything to enter. And so that was it. I mean, that's all I wanted to share. I thought the comments were just so wonderful and made me think of a couple simple things. Thank you.
Profound. Thank you, Robert. Let me call upon Rose, then Catherine, then Justin. Go ahead, Rose.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Well, even though this parsha is titled Vayeshev, there's no sitting down or settling really
Right.
in this, so it's very ironic. It's like Chaye Sarah. What happens? The first thing she dies, So the title is kind of misleading, but I think what you were saying about uncertainty and the need to move beyond the comfortable, and it just brings me all the way back to the beginning of all of this with the Garden of Eden, that Adam and Chava were not really human. They were kind of proto-humans or children until they were forced to go out. They ate of the tree of knowledge, and then they were forced to go out. And actually, by doing that, they realize their humanity and they actually become human. So so I think that that's what you're seeing in through this process of meeting adversity, learning and growing. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is there's a theme here of clothing and identity that really starts, I think, in the previous story about Jacob dressing up as Esau, and continues here. You have a situation where Joseph's clothing actually gets him into the trouble. It identifies him. Then it identifies him adversely to Jacob, when they dip it in the blood. And then he is wearing a cloak that gets torn off when he's with Potiphar's wife. And in the meantime, you also have Tamar, who takes off her widow's clothes and dresses in the clothes of a prostitute in order to fulfill what she sees is a holy mission, which is to carry on her dead husband's, you know, if the brothers-in-law won't do it, then the father-in-law has to do it. And the only way she can do that is by changing her clothes, changing her identity. So it's fascinating to me that this whole section really talks about how we assume different identities by, in our clothing, how we present ourselves, how we think of ourselves as we move through the world.
And Rose, I'm just going to extend that out a little bit because I think it's lovely the way you bring in all this notion about clothing. First, I'm going to extend it way back to the beginning of Genesis, uh, where the text seems to say that God dressed Adam and Eve. And the question is exactly what were they being dressed in? Were they being dressed in garments of skin, garments of light, something else? And then
Right.
move it forward, we will see Joseph. He's going to end up putting on a completely different set of garments.
Right. He'll be the Egyptian. He'll wear Egyptian clothes and thus has assumed a completely different identity.
Yeah, so that fascinating to point all that out. And so let me call upon Catherine and then Justin. Okay, Catherine.
Okay, well, I would like to build a little bit on what Rose just said. Um, I think, on the surface, what's amazing about this parsha is we have this sort of prediction that the offspring of Jacob will be foreigners and will be strangers in a land not theirs. And of course, the brothers end up in Egypt. Um, but what I think is really at the core of it is something that is in number 5 that Zornberg writes about the capacity to reintegrate the fragments of experience into new wholes. And I thought of that as a way of describing what Joseph does, which is his garment is torn. So in a sense, that is a garment that his father gave to him. So his relationship to his father, his link to his father, his direct link is torn because his brothers have removed his presence um, and taken the garment in its place. Um, and then I thought of it also ultimately referring to what happens to the brothers, right? And that the brothers kind of disagree with one another about what should be done. And Benjamin remains behind. And then there's a whole question of leaving Benjamin behind. And Joseph finally, in revealing himself, brings them together in a sense. He removes this anxiety of they're going to be separated because he says, after all, I am your brother. Um, and so, in a sense, symbolically, he brings together those fragments of the tunic and brings together the fragments of the family um, so that they can act in unison in relationship to this sojourning.
You know, we're going to read very soon this confrontation between Joseph and his brothers, and one of the things that we're going to experience, I think, will be the way in which it is Judah who steps forward.
Right.
It is Judah. Why Judah instead of Reuben, the oldest, who steps forward to speak on behalf of the family? It's because of this incident with Tamar, where his own sense of identity and self and certainty was shattered. And he says, oh, she's actually been more righteous than I will. And it is that shattering of his own status,
Mhm.
uncertainty, that enables him now to be the one to step forward and to try and reweave the fabric, if you will, as you're saying, of the family. But it's that he's now at a higher level than he was before, and that's why he's able to do that. So I'm going to just call upon Justin, and then I'm also going to bring in another notion that Rose and others have mentioned, and it's a way to kind of weave this back together. So go ahead, Justin.
Thank you, Rabbi. And thank you for mention also in this, Catherine, of the Aviva Zornberg on Genesis, right? So, and I'd love to hear anything more about it. Aviva Zornberg's so amazing. I wanted to also, not really as an answer, but maybe just as a kind of a comment. One of the things that was coming to me was, like, just what is it like to be down at the bottom of this well for Joseph? And one of the best pieces of contemporary literature that has chapters about a person who's stuck at the bottom of a dry well is called The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. This Japanese author, right? So there's some serious meditations. Not necessarily that it gets to anything that says, "Oh, well, you know what this means." It's a novel, but there's a lengthy meditation about really being stuck down there and really facing oneself in that place. Some just a kind of suggestion and that. Thank you.
Thank you for offering up that bit of insight and that new piece of literature for us to be able to look at. And then maybe you could just type that into the chat, the title as well. And then I want to go back to a comment that Rose made about, this says Vayeshev is the name of the Torah portion, and it seems ironic because there's really no settling. And it may well be that what Torah is doing here, Torah is in a sense challenging our notion about what it means to settle. It may be that it's saying, oh, you thought you were going to read something in which a voice said, oh, look, you can have this land upon which you can settle. It'll always be yours. You'll be safe and secure there, and it'll be a place of permanence. That's what you thought it meant to settle, right? And then Torah kind of pulls the rug out from us and says, no, what it means to settle is to live a life that is in alignment, in attunement with the source of all of existence. And what it means to live that way is it means to live in a place of yud he vav he-ness, of constant becomingness, rather than static settledness. And so it presents this notion, this character, Jacob, who says, okay, I'm ready to live that way. I'm ready to live the way in which we will always be sojourners in a land not ours. And that's not about geography. That's about one's existential beingness, to live in a way in which one is constantly exposing oneself, in a sense, to challenges, to the unknown, and to live in a way that can sail through the unknown. Because even though you don't know what the outcome is going to be, you know that's the way we need to go, because that's the way I'm going to grow and develop. So this is in fact perhaps very much a sense of, this is about settlement. It's just that it's not about land. It's about how to live. And it's how to live with a sense of some degree of serenity in the midst of upheaval and chaos. The capacity to have a tolerance for uncertainty, a way to live in which one is thrilled by mystery, in which one is driven not for answers, but for more questions. And that seems to be the way Torah is pointing us, because when we look at the entirety of Torah, the entirety of the Jewish Bible, there is no resolution. It's a movement from one uncertainty to the next. And that's not presented as a negative fatalistic thing. That's presented as that's what it means to be a human being. And so that's why Adam and Eve are these characters who are presented to us. And I think Rose used the term proto-human. They're presented as the caricatures that oh, how nice it would be to live in paradise. We didn't have to work and you didn't feel any pain. And so, no, what it means to be a human being is to labor, is to feel pain, is to feel loss, and it's also to feel a sense of wonder and awe and gratitude and in the adventure of it all. And that's what it means to live the way of love. And I'm so grateful to each and every one of you who create an environment in which we can sustain ourselves in our sense of the unknown, in which we can sustain ourselves with not being certain about the outcome, but being certain about the presence of one another. That's the way of love.
Happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Happy Hanukkah.
You all look forward to our next gathering. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.